Sam has lived and worked in London for 22 years and is the financial director at London's largest rare bookseller. When not surrounded by antiquarian volumes, Sam enjoys finding her own ancient rare objects. A keen fossil hunter for over a decade and volunteer leader with the UK Association of Fossil Hunters, Sam began mudlarking 5 years ago as an activity she can enjoy closer to home and has been engrossed ever since. Sam has found museum-quality fossils and mudlarking finds and has collaborated with Jason on several occasions. You may have seen some of Sam's fossils in Beachcombing magazine and in Mudlark's Treasures from the Thames by Jason Sandy. Jason is an American architect and author who lives in London. Beachcombing along the River Thames, he's found historic artifacts, some of which are now on display in museums in the UK. Jason's written almost 30 articles for Beachcombing magazine about mudlarking finds, from tiny beads to cannonballs and everything in between. He's found historical treasures from every era of London's history and prehistory. Jason is a member of the Society of Thames Mudlarks and author of 2 books about mudlarks and mudlarking. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Jason and Sam to do their story.
Great, thanks so much for having us. And I've given several presentations about mudlarking. This is the first one actually about fossil hunting. And Sam is a complete expert on fossil hunting, and that's why she's here with us today and is actually going to do most of the talking. My part of the presentation is more about just like the scenery of the Jurassic coast and taking you on the journey. And for me as a complete novice, kind of sharing that kind of firsthand experience when you step foot on the beach for the first time and the thrill of finding your first fossil and taking the kids with you and everything like that. So without further ado, we'll get started. Let's see if I can click through. Perfect. Can you see my next slide? Excellent. So the mecca of fossil hunting in the UK, or at least along the south coast, the Jurassic coast specifically, is Lyme Regis. So this is Great Britain. This is Ireland over on this side. So just to give you a little bit of context, and this is France over on this side. So just zooming in, this is Cornwall, and the Jurassic coast stretches over 2 different parts of the country, Dorset and Devon. And Sam will give you a little bit more historical information about those locations. But if you are flying in to go fossil hunting, probably the nearest airport is still London. It's about a 3-hour drive. Bristol is not too far. Cardiff is just across the bay, but I would say that probably London is the closest international airport if you are interested in coming over and going fossil hunting for yourselves. Then zooming in just a little bit closer, one feature that you will notice here is it's actually, it looks like an island, but it's actually a peninsula. It does have a land bridge that goes across. This is the island of Portland, the Isle of Portland rather. And Kate will talk about, Sam will talk a little bit more about that in a second. So Sam, did you want to talk about just the setup of the Jurassic coast?
Sure. Thank you, Kirsty and Jason, for inviting me to be part of this talk. Jason's billed me as an expert, but I should probably point out that I've only been fossil hunting for about 10 years, and I actually did my first ever fossil hunt on the Jurassic coast at Lyme Regis. So this is really close to my heart because this is where I first learned how to fossil hunt. I began at Lyme Regis, but I've fossil hunted most of this coastline now. And you can see from the image on the screen, the Jurassic coast is a large area. It's 95 miles, which is 155 kilometers long from east to west. And it spans 185 million years of geological time, covering the entire Mesozoic period, which was the period when it's famous for the dinosaurs. And there isn't anything else like it in the world because it's all on the coastline and it's a very dynamic coast. You get a lot of erosion and a lot of rocks are exposed, which is why you can find fossils there and why they're constantly replenished, which is why it is such a popular location for fossil hunting. And it's so important for the fossils in it and for the natural beauty and just the incredible geology and nature that the area was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2001. So it's very well known, it's protected, and I would absolutely recommend it for a visit. If we move on to the next slide, Jason, thank you for steering. There we go. That's a colourful representation of what's going on under the surface in terms of the Jurassic coast. So you can see there's a key at the bottom, and that just explains the types of rocks that are there. So rocks are deposited in geological sequence, and each sequence is given names. Actually, quite a lot of them get their names and are identifiable by the fossils that are in them. So there are a lot of zones which are named from the fossils that are in them. And you can see there's an awful lot going on in the Jurassic coast, which is why there's an enormous diversity of fossils. And also it also helps make that part of the coastline really dynamic, because when you've got a lot of different types of rock going on, it does make them a bit more liable to crumble away. And you can see there's a symbol at the bottom where there's faults and monoclines. So there's been a lot of activity in that area. And when you look at the rocks and you see all of these different deposits, it's telling you that the landscape was changing a great deal during the Mesozoic period, and that seas were coming and going. Sometimes the area was coastal, sometimes the seas were quite deep, other times it was quite marshy. So all of these different types of rocks tell you the story of what's going on in time, in historical time, and the fossils that are in the rocks tell you about that life. If we go to the next slide, Jason, thank you. Essentially, the Jurassic coast is a timeline through the whole of the Mesozoic period, and it broadly runs from west to east. So you can see on this sort of close-up that we've got the area on the border with Devon. So you can see it's labelled East Devon, and starting at Exmouth, and you've got some orange shading on the coastline. And that's telling us that those rocks are Triassic in age. So that's the earliest part of the Mesozoic period. And they're not terribly rich for fossils, but it was a period when there was a lot of desert. You can imagine, actually, this was very close to the end of the Triassic period, and there was a big mass extinction at the end of the Triassic period. Every time you get a change in geological period, it basically symbolizes a mass extinction. And so you can see from the key on the diagram that it was very dry, it was very desert-like. And you can get these incredible geological features like these pillars and stacks that you can see. And it's a really just beautiful part of the coastline to visit. It's got caves, it was quarried. So you can visit the quarries at Beer, for example. And Budleigh Salterton's very famous for the rocks that you can find on the beach there. So if you enjoy pebbles, Budleigh Salterton's a really great place to go. Moving on to the next slide, Jason, please. This is where we really get into the meat and bones of the Jurassic coast. So here you're moving into the Jurassic period, and you can see Lyme Regis at the very left-hand side of the slide. To tell you, I mean, the key on this slide tells you it's the birthplace of paleontology, and I'll maybe talk about that a little bit later when I know Jason's got some slides from the Natural History Museum in London, so that's a good place to talk a little bit about that. But Lyme Regis really is a mecca for fossil hunters, because it's got very crumbly, very dynamic cliffs of soft clay which preserve fossils in very good condition, and large numbers of them. And because it's soft rock and it's constantly falling into the sea and suffering erosion, you get lots of fossils all the time. The fact that it's very popular means that you also get a lot of people collecting there. So if you go in the height of summer, a lot of people are on holiday and they're looking for fossils, and it gets harder to find things. But I'd be surprised if you could come away without finding something from the beach. You're pretty much guaranteed to find a fossil at Lyme Regis. And even if you don't find something to take home, the beach is littered with huge blocks full of fossils, which aren't the kind of thing that you can take away, but you can enjoy them. And they just look beautiful. The wealth of fossils there is incredible. It's such a beautiful part of the world. Moving along, you can see marked on the coastline, you've got Golden Cap, which is the tallest point on the coast. And actually under Golden Cap, you're still getting a lot of fossils. You get things like belemnites and ammonites and crinoids, which are very common here. So it's all pretty much all marine fossils, because these are all sedimentary rocks and they were all formed in water environments. But sometimes it was sea and sometimes it was fresh water. So we know that the geology was changing, and you could tell this from the fossils. But you do occasionally get fossils which have come from the land. So Lyme Regis is famous for a dinosaur called a Scelidosaurus, which small pieces have been found. And you can also sometimes find insects, and that tells you that land couldn't have been too far away, because these are land fossils that have been washed into the sea. Moving a bit further along, you can see towards the centre of the picture, you can see Chesil Beach, which is a natural barrier beach formed entirely of pebbles, and it has a lagoon behind it called the Fleet. And that's another really good place to find fossils. And by now they're quite different to the kinds of fossils that you get in Lyme Regis. So as we move on, you'll see some of the fossils that you can find there. And then you get to the Isle of Portland. And I know Jason's got a really good story to tell about the Isle of Portland. Do you want to jump in, Jason?
Yes, so as many of you know, I'm an architect working here in London, and the Isle of Portland is very famous for the quality of stone that's quarried from the island. And most of London, in terms of the municipal buildings and even the churches, are built in the Portland stone, as we call it. And literally, it's littered with fossils. So I've been there twice, down into the caves, into the mines. And this is a slab that I brought back not too long ago. I'm not sure if you can see my screen, but do you see the individual fossils that have been formed within the rock? So it's quite amazing that you can actually build buildings made out of fossils. So it's actually limestone, but there's like hundreds of fossils within them. And most famously, St. Paul's Cathedral is built with this stone, and many other buildings, governmental buildings. Buckingham Palace is built with Portland stone as well. So it's a very famous isle for all the building material that comes from there.
It's like working in London myself, I see the fossils a lot. Green Park Station is great for those fossils. It's absolutely beautiful. If we move on to the next slide and we continue eastward along the coast, we get into an area which Jason's going to talk a lot more about when we get to some of his beautiful photographs. And you can see on the left-hand side, right on the left-hand side, you can see a little place called White North. And that is when you begin to move out of the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous period. And that's marked by a transition to chalk, which is very common on the south coast of England. We're obviously very famous for it. Everybody's heard of the White Cliffs of Dover, but White North is a white cliff, and quite a lot of the coastline in South and East Dorset is chalk, and you get incredible chalk cliffs, which are very beautiful. And chalk is also full of fossils. So in chalk, you'll get things like ammonites, you'll get brachiopods and bivalves, fossil shells. You get corals, and you get one of my favorite types of fossil, which is echinoids. And actually further along the coast, right at the end where you see Old Harry Rocks and Studland Bay, that's where I found my first ever echinoid. So that place is really special to me for fossil hunting. It's the first of, I probably have hundreds, literally hundreds of echinoids now. I can't get enough of them, but my first came from there. So that's quite special to me. But Jason will talk a bit more about this area of coastline, but there's some incredible geology. There are really beautiful natural rock formations, beautiful coves. There's a fossil forest just near Lulworth Cove, which you can see on the map there, just to the left of Lulworth Cove, to the right of Lulworth Cove. You can see the fossil forests marked. A little bit further along the coast, towards the centre of the picture, you'll see a place called Worth Matravers, which isn't on the coast, it's inland. And there's an area at Worth Matravers, a quarry, where, as they were separating the layers of the stone for quarrying, for building stone, they discovered a dinosaur trackway. So there is an enormous dinosaur trackway there, huge sauropod footprints, and you can go and visit that, and you can actually stand in the footprints. So that's an incredible thing to see. So it's not just about shells and ammonites and sea beasts. There's some really good dinosaur footprints to be found in Dorset too. I guess the last thing I want to say on this slide, which might be news to Jason, actually, we didn't talk about it before today, is that in Kimmeridge Bay, you can see a place called Kimmeridge marked on the map towards the centre. And just above that, there's a little sign that says the Etchers Collection. Kimmeridge Bay is very well known for incredible fossils that have been found by a man called Steve Etchers. And he, I think he's an electrician originally, and he was an amateur fossil hunter, self-taught, and he has discovered throughout his lifetime some incredible fossils, done amazing research on them, discovered new species, and the things that he's found over the years are now housed in the Etchers Collection, and it's a world-class museum, and I would absolutely recommend a visit if ever you're in Dorset. But the other interesting fact about Kimmeridge is that the geology there is a type of stone called Kimmeridge clay, and Jason might well have heard of these, but Kimmeridge clay and the Kimmeridge shales were used to make shale bracelets for the Romans, who really enjoyed having this beautiful jewellery because it was very similar to jet, which was very prized but also very scarce. And shale from Kimmeridge was quarried and it was made into jewellery for the Romans. And I've actually, if it probably doesn't come out very well on the camera, but there we go. This is just a little fragment of a Roman shale bracelet, which I found on the Thames foreshore, and that would have been made in Kimmeridge. So, so that's a really nice collection. So shale is basically a fossil. So it's a fossil rock that's been made into a bracelet for a Roman, and it neatly brings my fossil hunting and mudlarking hobbies together. So
Great. Thanks for telling us about the setup, Sam. So what I'm going to show you in just the next few slides is it's not all about the fossils, it's also about the beauty of the coastline. And it's one of the most beautiful parts of England, definitely along the south coast. This is, as we were mentioning before, Old Harry Rocks, which is beautiful limestone cliffs that are slowly eroding. So very similar to the White Cliffs of Dover or Seven Sisters, if you've been along to that part near Eastbourne, but just beautiful landscapes. And this is a helicopter view. I wish we could actually see it from that vantage point. But you can see the little dots, which are people that are allowed to walk along the cliffs. So you have to be careful, but you can go and actually really enjoy the beauty close up. As you go further along the coastline, we're kind of going further west along the coastline. This is the famous location called Durdle Door. And it sounds like something out of Harry Potter. And it actually looks like a dinosaur itself kind of coming out of the water, going into the water. And it's a beautiful formation. And again, it's open to the public, so you can drive there and spend the afternoon in the sunshine, as you can see the people on the beach here, and also do a bit of fossil hunting. So it's kind of dual purpose, a beautiful scenery, as well as the bonus of being able to take home a nice fossil when you're there. The cliffs are quite dramatic. You've got beautiful green pastures with sheep and other livestock walking along the beautiful terrain. And then you have these vertical drops that are the cliffs and then the beach below. As you'll see, my son is featured quite a few times in these slides because he loves this area of England so much. And it really is, I would encourage you to take your children there because it gets them very excited about geology, paleontology, dinosaurs. Most kids always love dinosaurs. So my son really loves this area of England. And it is stunning. These photographs are primarily taken in April. We had 2 trips there, and both times we had very good weather, so we were very fortunate. The other good thing is everyone loves a good English pub, and they're kind of dotted along the coastline as well. So after a very long day of fossil hunting or hiking along the coastal pathways on the cliffs, you can cool down and refresh yourself in some of these nice coastal pubs. This is Seatown, walking further west then. Going a bit further, these are the famous cliffs that are along the coast. Sam, do you remember the name? I can't see the name because it's blocked by my...
What the name of the cliffs?
Yes, exactly.
The cliffs are West Bay, the ones at the front, and the ones further along in the background, the same color, are Burton Bradstock, which is another really famous fossil location. But West Bay is where they filmed Broadchurch. If anybody ever saw the BBC series Broadchurch with David Tennant and Olivia Colman, that's West Bay where that was filmed.
Yeah. One thing that you'll start to notice here, which will become a feature further down the coast, is the erosion. So you can see these cliffs are exposed to the waves. And as Sam will probably tell you later, the best time to go fossil hunting is probably around February. So after these winter storms have come through, they're constantly eroding the cliffs and then pulling the fossils out. And that's why they're landing on the beach. But it's very dangerous to walk directly underneath the cliffs because they're constantly falling down. And you can see one of these pillars has dropped in that location. So you always have to be very, very careful as you're going along the cliffs themselves. This is actually in Charmouth, which is also another mecca of fossil hunting. So between Lyme Regis and Charmouth, those are probably the 2 top hotspots along the Jurassic coast. And again, you can see some of the erosion. These muddy cliffs have sunk down. And again, you can see fresh deposits here on the foreshore. So you do see people chiseling or hammering away along this cliff, but it's very dangerous. So I wouldn't recommend it. It's always better to kind of look where they've been washed out. Again, if you go after a nice storm, it's always the best time to go fossil hunting. You can see Golden Cap, as Sam mentioned, that's the tallest peak along this part of the coastline. There in the distance. So not only are the cliffs very exciting and being down on the beach, but also there's coastal walkways, the entire length of the Jurassic coast. And many families go camping and they just take their gear, they pack lightly, just have backpacks, and they just go from place to place camping along the Jurassic coast. And then you spend the day fossil hunting and then hiking a bit further. And there's quite a few coastal towns where you can restock your supplies. So that's one of my bucket list dreams one day, is actually hike the whole Jurassic coast along the cliffs. I've done a lot of walking along the beach, but I'd love to do the cliffs as well because of the gorgeous scenery all along the coastline. So this is the famous location, Lyme Regis. This is actually low tide, and I'll show you a picture at high tide as well. Again, it's tidal dependent, and in England, the tidal reach is very vast. So all of this is covered up at high tide, so you can't get on the beach at all. So you always have to watch your tide times, make sure you don't get caught out because it does come in very quickly as you're on the beach. This is a little bit further west. This is called Sidmouth. And as Sam was mentioning before, the red cliffs along this part of the coastline show that it's much older than the Jurassic cliffs that you saw previously. The other thing that you'll notice again is the coastal erosion, fresh collapses of the cliffs that just fell onto the beach, maybe even the night before, and a much larger one even further down that went all the way into the ocean. And you can see the color of the water is actually red just because it's constantly eroding away the mud, and the mud and silt is just dispersing into the water itself. So before we actually take you down onto the beach to show you what fossils we can find, we're first going to start back in London at the Natural History Museum. I'm not sure if any of you have been there before, but it's absolutely spectacular. It's a Victorian building, as the name says. well, actually it doesn't say, but it was built by Prince Albert, so the husband of Queen Victoria, and Victoria and Albert Museum is actually right next door to this. So this is kind of a large exhibition and museum area in West London. So just going inside, there's a beautiful kind of vaulted ceiling, and normally there's either a dinosaur, at the moment there's a blue whale kind of suspended from the ceiling as you go in, which is quite spectacular. And the reason why we're coming here, and many of you might have seen the movie Paddington Bear, and a lot of the scenes were actually shot within the museum because they were the villain was trying to stuff Paddington Bear and put him on display. But anyways, the reason why we brought you here is to show you the vast array of skeletons and fossils that have been found along Lyme Regis coastline and the Jurassic coast. They're all on the wall here, some of the finest specimens that have ever been found. So Sam, I'll let you take over from here.
Okay, thanks, Jason. As Jason mentioned, these are some of the incredible fossils that have come out of the Jurassic coast. Not actually all of them from Dorset. Some of them have come from Yorkshire, which is kind of the secret second Jurassic coast. This is just a tiny, tiny number of the incredible specimens like this plesiosaur, which you can tell by the long bones in the hands. So these creatures, just to digress slightly, plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs are reptiles. So they breathed air. They had to come to the surface for the air. They didn't live constantly in the sea. And you can see that their hands have adapted into flippers by them growing extra finger bones. So their hands are both wider and longer. It's called polydactylism, and they evolved that so that they could swim in the water, but they did have to come to the surface to breathe. It was quite incredible how they were able to adapt to live in the oceans. Just an interesting side fact. But these beautiful specimens in the Natural History Museum are just the tiniest proportion of specimens that have come out of Lyme Regis and the Jurassic coast. There are other examples all over the world which have come from Dorset, and people are still finding them now. I was actually on the beach in one of my early fossil hunts in Lyme Regis, and somebody had found an ichthyosaur on the beach that morning, and I went back the next day to watch them extract it because the tide was coming in. And I've seen in the chat a few people have asked whether you can collect and keep the specimens, and the answer to that is yes, you can. You can take home whatever you find from the beaches, but I would encourage people not to over collect, so there's something there for everybody. But there are a few exceptions, and I'll speak a little bit about that later. But in the instance of finding a complete specimen, you do have to get permission to extract it. You can't dig it out of the rocks. And so the one that I saw found, they did go back, they got permission from the Heritage Centre, and they went back the next day to extract it. And it was an extraordinary thing to witness. So the most famous fossil collector from Lyme Regis, I'm sure everybody now knows, is Mary Anning, who was, you can see here, she was fossil collecting at the start of the 19th century. And at that time, people didn't really understand fossils. It was a time when it was really the paleontology was a nascent science. People were very much, they read their Bible and they were told that God created everything. And Bishop Ussher had put a timeline on that. And people were finding animals, fossil animals that didn't make sense with what was, with what they were seeing in real life in modern days. And they were trying to make sense of that. And that's really how paleontology evolved as a science, as people tried to make sense of what they were finding. But Mary Anning started out just collecting fossils as a means of making a living. Her father was a carpenter and they were a very poor family. And her father and Mary and her brother Joseph used to go out and collect fossils to sell as curios to the tourists. And one day, actually, her, if we move on, I think might be the next slide, or a couple of slides on, it's a little bit near the end, I think, Jason, but yeah, there we go. We can go back to the beautiful paleo art. This Mary Anning's brother, Joseph, found this skull sticking out of the cliff, and they'd never, ever seen anything like it. It was completely new to science. They managed to extract it. I mean, the eye is still intact. That pineapple ring looking thing are actually bones inside of the eye, which are to help the eye to be able to work it under the pressure of being in deep water. And Mary, who was only a child at the time, actually went back and found the rest of the skeleton in the cliff. And this was the first complete ichthyosaur to have ever been found. And it was taken and studied. In fact, Mary went on to discover the first plesiosaur skeleton, which caused quite a lot of controversy. So the plesiosaurs are those really long-necked ones. It was quite controversial at the time because nobody could believe that a neck on an animal could be as long as that. And they said, oh, you've put the head on the wrong end, or you've made it up. And it was when she found a complete one and she was able to demonstrate, that it was all one skeleton as found, that people finally believed her. And actually it demonstrated that Mary, instead of just collecting pieces of rock, she was studying them and had an inquiring scientific mind, and she was able to think about how to make sense of these creatures that she was finding, and she could speculate on the parts of the skeleton which weren't together or weren't all there, and make sense of what the whole would look like. And actually she beat the scientists to it, and eventually they accepted her theories. And she also discovered fossil poo. She realized that stones that were found on the beach that people called bezoar stones were actually fossilized poo from animals like sharks and ichthyosaurs. She discovered the first pterosaur from Lyme Regis. And she also figured out that black stains that she was seeing on the rock were actually the fossils of squid ink, which is just mind-blowing, to be honest. So Jason's got some beautiful illustrations here of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs swimming in Jurassic seas, preying on belemnites. So those squid-like creatures that plesiosaur is going after, that's what belemnites are thought to have looked like. We don't get a lot of soft tissue preservation, but there's enough to be able to build a picture of this. And sometimes you find the little hooklets from the end of the tentacles. And just these incredible fossils have been abundant for 200 years now from Lyme Regis. They're just incredible things to see. Vast, beautiful skeletons. Ichthyosaurs look kind of sweet, don't they? You'd need a big aquarium to keep one as a pet, but you would, wouldn't you, if it was big enough? So you can see they're very, very fine, sharp teeth, which are suitable for puncturing shells to get at the soft animals inside. There's again, this one's an ichthyosaur. You can tell the difference if you look at the paddles. The bones are very different in the paddles compared to the plesiosaur. So they've got kind of almost sort of hexagonal bones in the hands. So there you can see whilst they might look a little bit similar, they did evolve quite differently. So totally different animals that both adapted to live in the sea, but both air-breathing reptiles. So ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs aren't dinosaurs. They're marine reptiles and evolved. They branched off from the dinosaurs before the dinosaurs became known as dinosaurs. There's those little sharp teeth for puncturing shells. They know what they ate because some of the fossils actually include stomach contents. So you can actually see inside the ribs, you can see black stains of bits of shells and the little hooks from the belemnite tentacles. It's fascinating, amazing what's preserved in these fossils.
Great. So that was just a little bit of the best fossils that have been found down there on the Jurassic coast. So as we mentioned earlier, this is the home of Jurassic Coast there in Lyme Regis, and it's a World Heritage Site. And I took this photograph on my first trip to Lyme Regis. And what I would recommend for you guys as well, similar to what we did, is you don't quite know what to look for unless you go with a tour guide the first time. So Mary Anning's house is located right on the coast, and it's actually now been converted into a museum. And it's very cheap. I think it was only 15 pounds to actually book a tour guide that takes a group of about 15 to 20 people out. And they kind of show you a specimen of each type of fossil that you should look for. And they kind of show you how things are kind of set up. So look in the gravelly bits, don't look in the sandy bits, obviously. So it's quite helpful just as a little bit of a training just to do one of those guided tours. So I'd highly recommend that on your first time when you go out. Also, you'll notice that the tide is all the way up pretty much on the coastline now, whereas the previous slide that I showed you, it was low tide and very far out. So definitely go when it's at the lowest tide in order to find the greatest amount of fossils. And normally what you can do is you can walk along the coastline from Lyme Regis to Charmouth at low tide, and then walk back if you've parked at Lyme Regis or vice versa. So they're quite easy to walk to in between places. The one thing that I will note is that there is a Victorian dump that's washing out into the sea. And there's a couple of nasty things that are in that dump itself. And unfortunately, the first time that I went there, a World War II grenade had washed out of the cliff. And some beachcomber had picked it up, thought it was a pineapple at first, and then fortunately just set it down, called the bomb disposal unit. And there was a loud bang when they blew it up actually on the beach because they couldn't move it because they didn't want it to obviously blow up. So that was a bit of excitement the first time that I went fossil hunting. I didn't even know about the Victorian dump the first time I went. But for all of you sea glass lovers, this is also ideal because there's a lot of Victorian sea glass that's being washed in and then churned around. And I'll show you a few slides later where there's beautiful pieces of sea glass that are equal to what you find in California and around the world. So the first thing that you'll notice, and I'll just go back one slide, these are kind of mud flats that are just submerged below the surface and then are exposed at low tide. And in the mud flats, you're going to see a lot of impressions of the ammonites. So this is one of the first ammonites that I saw. And having seen or read books and seen them in the museums here in London, it was quite exciting. The first one that I spotted myself. And of course, the kids absolutely loved it. And once you spot one, you start to spot them everywhere. They range from very small sizes to one was larger than my foot. So it's quite extraordinary to think how large these sea creatures, these ammonites were back then in the Jurassic period. This is another impression. Unfortunately, because it's in clay, I took these home and they tend to disintegrate quite quickly when the clay dries out. So it's hard to preserve these impressions, but we'll start to show you some of the other ammonites that we find that are much better and more sturdy condition. So this is the setup looking back towards Lyme Regis, and you can see the big coastal wall here to stop the erosion closer to town. Because the beach is constantly moving and the waves are constantly eroding the cliffs, some houses are falling into the sea. So they've kind of shored it up there around the town. But then here in this area, everything is completely exposed. And you can imagine with these large winter storms, they're really churning up everything. So this is the kind of hot spot for finding the smallest of ammonites. You also find boulders, like literally this is huge. And you can see hundreds of ammonites that are within this rock. And it's just been worn smooth over time, just through the waves and the wind, eroding away even the rocks. I just love this photograph, and you can count hundreds within this one photograph. And so all of these, obviously, as the ammonites died, they fell onto the seabed, and they just kind of laid in the sediment until it became a fossil. And that's why you find so many compacted or pressed on top of each other. It's almost like an ammonite grave site. So this is my son holding a large boulder that has some ammonites in there. And as Sam mentioned earlier, you're allowed to take home anything that you find. You should record anything that you think is of significance or that is very unusual. But our car was significantly heavier on the way home in comparison when we first drove there. So we took quite a few home with us. And what I would recommend, everybody has a hammer and a small chisel. You shouldn't go crazy when you're down there, but everybody is kind of hammering away, trying to crack open some of these pods. And I think Sam will show you some of these pods, what they look like initially. But when you crack them open, sometimes you have a beautiful ammonite inside. So everybody's hammering away. It's also recommended to take some safety goggles with you because there are pieces of rock flying in all directions when you're hammering away. And obviously you just need to be careful because people are swinging constantly. So you need to stay clear of anybody else on the beach that's hammering. So my favorite type of ammonite is the ones that are made out of pyrite. So over the centuries, what's happened is the void, so where the ammonite has fallen onto the seabed, over time it deteriorates and it creates a cavity. And within the cavity, small fissures allow fluid minerals to flow into that cavity and fill it up again. So this isn't the actual ammonite itself. This is almost a casting, and it's actually made of iron pyrite. So fluid iron pyrite would go into the cracks and fill the void. And then over time, the rock breaks away. But because the metal is so hard, these come out looking like museum pieces. You can't believe actually that they're real. They're just so perfectly formed, this beautiful spiral. And that's what everybody, well, at least I was hunting for the most. Ammonites are very similar to a modern day nautilus. So this is a similar nautilus that you would see today. And they swim backwards and they have tentacles that kind of push. So similar to an octopus that kind of pushes out to project itself forward. These move their tentacles to push them in the opposite direction. And the shell obviously creates a protective environment so they aren't preyed on by everything. But as we saw, some of these marine reptiles have rather large teeth. So they were a favorite diet of some of the big reptiles. This is a close-up photo of what that would have looked like. This is obviously an artistic illustration of what they would have looked like. And these, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, they range between about 220 million years old to 80 million years old. So quite a large time frame that these lived within the warm waters of the sea here in southern England. So again, the coastline is just so dramatic at low tide. And my son and my whole family really enjoyed just going and searching amongst the rocks. And it's a great way to get the kids off of screens and out in the fresh air, and just the thrill of the hunt and the discovering of these beautiful ammonites and other belemnites, which you see here. Sam will talk about them a little bit later, but these were, as you saw in that earlier illustration, these squid-like animals, and these were at the front of the point, and that would create a very hard skeleton for them to kind of move through the water. So you find they almost look like pencils that have been snapped. You find them all along the coast, but I was specifically searching for the ammonites, and these again are the ones made of iron pyrite. So a lot of sea glass down there. Obviously green is probably the most predominant color, but you do find yellows, you do find amber, some reds and blues, along with the ammonites. So this was a handful of sea glass that my daughter and wife collected while my son and I were hunting for the ammonites. So this was after one day's search. So it was quite a successful day. And that was in summer. So Sam says summer's not so good, but even then you can still find things if you know what to look for and know where to look for them. This is one of the largest ammonites that I found, probably nothing compared to what Sam has found. But here is what it looked like after I cleaned it. And it's got a beautiful spiral structure, as all the ammonites have. And it's just so satisfying to find these and be able to put them in your pocket and take them home. And my son has a display table at home where he has all of his fossils from the Jurassic coast on there, but not quite as extraordinary as the fossils that Sam has collected over the last 10 years. And I'll hand over to Sam to show us some of her best fossils that she's found along the Jurassic coast.
Thanks, Jason. So on your screen at the moment is kind of a sample. Remember at the very beginning, we talked about the Jurassic coast, and we had the map showing it running all the way from west to east, and I kind of talked our way along it. So these fossils in the image are set out broadly in the same direction. So if you start on the left of your screen, there are some fossils from Lyme Regis. So at the top there is there's a fossil Gryphea. It's a type of oyster. So that's, if I do it in my other hand, that's the oyster that you can see on the screen there. They get called devil's toenails because they look kind of gnarly like that. So they're quite a common fossil on the Jurassic coast. You've got a fossil poo. There we go. Here's that's a fossil poo. So it's kind of brown and swirly. It's a little bit eroded. If you get a fresh one, it really will look like a poo, and you can tell the black and dark swirls in it that you can see on the picture is tiny little crushed up pieces of bone from whichever poor unfortunate fish became that shark or ichthyosaur's dinner that evening. So yeah, at the bottom of the picture you've got a piece of a crinoid branch. So that's the piece that you can see at the bottom. These are all from Lyme Regis. You've got a belemnite, you've got a couple of ichthyosaur vertebrae. So those are the pieces with the little dimple in the middle. They've got a dimple on both sides. You can kind of squeeze them between your fingers, and your finger and thumb will just fit really nicely into those little dimples. And you're usually going to find them beach rolled. I visited for 4 years before I found my first, but now I pretty much find one every time I go. So they are there, and they're just lying on the beach. All of the items that you can see on screen are things that I have found lying on the beach. None of them have involved hitting rocks. You can hit rocks. So I've been just checking the questions as we've been going through, and people have been asking if you can take what you find away. Nobody's really asked about, I think one person asked about whether you could hit the cliffs. So the Jurassic coast is a site of special scientific interest. So you can't hit any of the rocks that are in the cliffs because they're protected, but it's also very dangerous to do so. The best place to find your fossils is on the beach, in loose pebbles, or even just completely loose on the beach. And everything that you can see there was loose pebbles or loose on the beach. But a couple of things have had a little bit of preparation done. So I hardly ever use a hammer. I take one out with me, I hardly ever use it. So things like these little ammonites, which you can see at the bottom of the screen now, they've had a little bit of preparation done just around the edges to make them show off. So you can see there's a little groove around the edges, but they were just on the surface of that piece of rock. The little pyrite ammonites you can see on the picture, exactly as I found them. Just above the ammonites, that little black stain on that piece of squarish rock, that's fossilized squid ink. I have to say, I didn't know that was what it was. But I did, like Jason, I did my first fossil hunts on the Jurassic coast as fossil walks to learn what I was seeing. And I went out with the museum, and I went out with the Heritage Centre at Charmouth, and it was the museum staff who taught me that was fossil squid ink, which I was just incredible that something so delicate could be preserved. The biggest fossil on the right hand side, which I'm also just holding up here, is a pair of plesiosaur vertebrae, and they're fused together. So you can just see on the picture there's a little line on the right hand side, which is where, thanks Jason, which is where the two vertebrae are fused together. And it's been rolled around for a long time, but that's quite unusual to find on the beach because plesiosaurs are a lot less common than ichthyosaurs. But they are all beach finds from Lyme Regis, and just there for the picking up. None of them are anywhere near scarce enough to need to report to the Heritage Centre. Generally, the general public aren't finding things that need reporting, but if ever you're in doubt, go to the museum or the Heritage Centre, show them what you've got, and they'll be more than happy to tell you what it is, and they will tell you if it's special. And even if it's not special, they can give you a description for it, and they'll be happy to do it. they're very happy to engage with everybody. The slide that's on screen now are some of the tiny fossils that I found, and they're from a little further east, from Seatown, which is an area just near Golden Cap. And I found these tiny fossils by looking in the clay and kind of washing it. So I collected a sample and I took it home and washed it, and then went through it with, you know, like a teaspoon at a time, looking for these tiny little fossils. And you can see some are even so small they're in little test tubes. And then on the next, really tiny, like 2 or 3 millimeters. These are also from Seatown. So you can see on the left-hand side, some crinoids. So those are the beautiful star-shaped ones that I don't think it comes out. Does it come out if I hold it really close to the camera? Probably not. But little star-shaped stems from sea lilies, which were animals rather than plants, like the name suggests. And can anybody have I mean, you know, when nature gives you stars, can anybody have enough, really? I don't think so. I can't get enough. I love them. They're just so beautiful. Continuing eastwards, so now we're working, these fossils are all from the Fleet Lagoon, where Chesil Beach is, just before the Isle of Portland. And we've got some shells now, so you can see already they look different from the fossils from Lyme Regis. They've come from a different layer. They've got a different type of preservation, and they're different species. So these rocks are younger, and by now different animals have evolved. So you've got some lovely brachiopods, and you've got some urchins on the right-hand side, and a couple of corals at the top. And these, again, are just picked up from the beach without any work needing to be done on them at all. You can just find them loose. So the whole Dorset coast, really, if you know where to look, there are beautiful fossils to be found without any tools at all. You just need your eyes and your hands. And I've seen in the chat a few people asking about where you can fossil hunt or how you can find locations. Somebody asked about whether it's just Yorkshire and sort of Dorset for the Jurassic coast. The whole of the UK is fantastic for fossils. We've got incredible geology, and most of the UK you can find fossils. So if you go onto a website called ukfossils.com, they've got a really good section of locations, and you can find out by county or by region, and you can see which beaches you can go to. It tells you directions to get there, where you can park, the kind of fossils that you might find there. It's a fantastic way to just find out if there's somewhere local to wherever you're visiting that might have fossils, and how to find them, what to look for. Yeah, these are all bones on the screen now, all from Lyme Regis. So the one that Jason's just circling is probably the one that I'm happiest with. So this is a paddle bone from an ichthyosaur, and I wanted to find one for a while and had never had one, and it's still the only one I've ever found. But to be fair, it's from the biggest ichthyosaur that ever lived, which was called Temnodontosaurus. So if you're only going to find one, you might as well find the biggest, right? So yeah, just that's one tiny little finger bone from one of those huge paddles. Yeah, that's an ichthyosaur vertebra. So that's again from a really big ichthyosaur, and this is from the Weymouth area. So you can see when you look at it, it's still got that dimple in the middle that we saw on the ones from Lyme Regis, but it's obviously much bigger. So that was a much bigger animal, and different preservation because it's from further up the coast. This is a little sea urchin, and that's been preserved in calcite. So that's not the shell; it's the inside. It's like the pyrite ammonites that Jason showed you. It's the internal cast, but you can see the little dots. And the calcite's preserved all the little segments that the shell would have originally had. And that one, because it's calcite, the sunlight goes right through it, and you can see all of that amazing detail. So it's like a little jewel. It's beautiful. And that's an example of finding a pebble and the potential that might be in it. So this was just a little pebble on the beach, and I gave it to somebody who does fossil preparation, who has proper tools to get inside the rock and to remove it. So they use They used tiny little, almost like tiny little hammers, fine pointed hammers, pneumatic tools, and air abraders, which use a really fine powder to wear the rock array around the fossils. And that was what was inside, which who knew a little pebble could have so much potential. So sometimes you just have to look. I mean, the one on screen, you can see this is the back of the one in the middle of the picture. And you can just see there's like a little shadow of detail on the outside. And that was enough to tell me there was an ammonite inside. And so when I had it prepared, this was what came through. So that's the other side of it, still with all the shell on and looking beautiful. And it's quite inexpensive to get a fossil prepared. So if you know someone who has the tools, I think usually people charge maybe 20 or 30 pounds an hour, and a little pebble like that would take maybe 30 minutes. So it's not expensive to get it done. You can even get it done while you're in Lyme Regis by some preparators. There's lots of people who do it. That's another beautiful prepared ammonite block from Lyme Regis. So yeah, that's another one that I found that I'm just waiting to come back. They're sent off to be prepared, but it's an example of the same kind of ammonite. What you see before you get the rock prepared and what you get after the spare rock has been removed to reveal the ammonite inside.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. Just one last thing. Kirsty mentioned that Kirsty and I put a book together last year. It's available in all good bookstores. But the reason why I'm showing this slide, and Kirsty kind of stole my thunder earlier, is that Sam and I have written an article about all of the fossils that have been found in the River Thames. So today was all about the Jurassic coast. But if you do want to read more about fossils from England, then there's a whole chapter of the book dedicated to some of the fantastic fossils, and even mammoth teeth, a skull from a woolly rhinoceros found in England, found in the Thames, and then a variety of other different types of fossils. And Sam, maybe you can tell us just briefly about this very interesting one that Kirsty mentioned at the very beginning.
So that's from the London clay, which is the predominant type of rock in the Thames estuary, and it's a fossil crab. And so you can see its little sort of jaws and teeth at the front, and then the carapace on the top, and it's just preserved absolutely beautifully. And I found it exactly like that. It wasn't even in any rock. It just was freshly out of a clay slip, and I found it just like that. It's amazing. It's like 50 million years old.
But I think it looks, as Kirsty mentioned, like a Chinese dragon. You see its nose here, two nostrils, the eyes kind of squinting, and then its big kind of chubby cheeks. So, and a big smile at the bottom. But it's an amazing fossil. And as Kirsty mentioned also, I featured about 33 different mudlarks in the book. And for instance, this page, this is Sam, and she's written a little bit about her interests and how she got into fossil hunting and into mudlarking. So it really makes the book a lot more personal when you can read stories about the people that actually find these artifacts that are featured in the book. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you guys will be on the next plane coming over and going fossil hunting for yourselves. Thank you.
Bet. Cannot wait. I bet you just have a whole new slew of people who want to come hunt for fossils.